Greetings, fellow hobbyists, and welcome to another episode of Sork's Mech Shop. Sorry for taking such a long hiatus since the last episode. I've been spending all my time growing this fine beard. Actually, I've had a little bit of personal issues that have kept me off the channel and kept me away from hobbying for the last few weeks, but I'm back and I'm enjoying myself and looking forward to presenting you this video today. Today's video is taking a little bit of a detour from all the painting we've been doing so far, and today we're getting to one of my pieces of the hobby that really drew me back in after being away from it for a few years, and that is kit bashing. Today we'll be kit bashing an orc Big Mek in Mega Armour for my personal army. I've been using a proxy for it for quite some time now, and while I have a tournament coming up in August for the Nova Triples event with a couple of my friends, I decided to actually build this guy out of GW parts in order to be legal for the event, and decided to share the experience with you all. So starting off, Kitbash. Some of you may or may not know where that term comes from. It originates with the historical models community, where folks would take, and they wouldn't necessarily have a model for a particular tank or vehicle that they wanted to make a model out of. You know, companies just didn't make the model back in the day. And so they would take models that were different but close enough, and maybe take 2 or 3 models, take pieces out of each one, combine them, create the tank that they wanted or the vehicle that they wanted. And so 40K players, especially back in the days when GW wasn't cranking out models for every single item that they had in the armies, started doing similar things, especially orc players. Orcs, for those of you who don't know, back in the day, they didn't make a lot of orc vehicles up until a few editions ago. And there's sort of a jingle or a meme among orc players that every kit's an orc kit, because these days the tradition carries on. A lot of orc players like just grabbing any kit from any other army and bashing it up and putting orc glyphs on it and making it look like it's made out of scrap metal and calling it a day. And my orc theme in particular, or excuse me, my army theme in particular, leans heavily on that as well. When I first started this army, I had a buddy that was running an eBay shop, and he had a bunch of leftover parts and pieces from different vehicle kits, and he just gave a bunch of them to me. And so when I started this particular army up, I'm like, okay, we're going Deathskulls, which are famous for looting, and every single vehicle I made was made from other people's kits and made unique. Every single one of them's a unique kit. Nothing looks alike. Specifically, my Mega Armour knobs, who this Big Mek and Mega Armour leads, were made from parts. Well, it was basically a simple head swap, really. I took parts from Necromunda ambots and then added the heads from orc nobes, and that was pretty much it. The paint effects really sell the overall job, because I make those look more orky through being, battered, worn, rusted, all that sort of thing, leaking oil, and put their sort of spin on it. And been really enjoying it. They look great on the table. My opponents usually like seeing them, and so I decided this guy's going to be very similar to that. I'm going to be taking the ambot legs still from one of the leftover kits I had, and using those to sort of keep him in theme with the rest of the squad. And then I've taken a new kit called the Arachne Rig, also from Necromunda. And that kit, as you can, I'll show you a picture in a second, but that kit will, or to me anyway, it looks very mech-like. It's got multiple arms, and they're different claws on the arms, and there's guns that you can put on there and so forth. And so I'm taking that to be the torso piece, and then just a bunch of bits from my bit box, some green stuff, some wire, some beads, all those sorts of things, and putting it all together. And I'm going to fast forward the video because the overall project took me about 2 hours, not including dry time, and I don't want to make you guys sit through 2 hours of my hands fumbling with things. But as we go through it, I'll talk you through my process, because really the process for kit bashing, for me at least, is a very organic one. You start off with a general idea of what you want. You have maybe the base kits that you have available are the ones you have in mind. You have a long-term end product in mind, kind of the vision of what you are trying to do. I usually try to stay reasonably close to the source model or the model that I'm trying to mimic. But other than that, it's kind of a wild, wild west. You just sort of pick up the pieces that seem to make sense. You try them out. You maybe file them down. You clip them down, throw them away, try something else. And so in this video, you'll see me try a couple different things and back up, try again, and so on. In some cases, a part might fall off and you might have to try again with a different part, or you might have to re-glue and so on. So it's as I said, it's a very organic process. I'll walk you through it and hopefully you enjoy watching. One of the first steps in any project like this, after you've gotten your initial vision put together, as I mentioned, is just to sort of take those pieces that you think you're going to use, dump them on the table, look at them, and just sort of handle them in person. Make sure that they look the way you thought they were going to look in your head. Make sure that they fit together the way you want them to, and try to identify any obvious differences or any obvious gaps between them. In this case, the Ambot legs and the Arachnorid body actually fit together pretty great. I was actually pleasantly surprised there. I thought I was going to have to do a bit more work and trimming in getting the waist of the torso to fit with the hips on the legs, but they were actually a perfect match. I don't know if that was intentional on the part of the sculptor or not, but it was pretty darn perfect. That said, one of the things I noticed during this stage was that that join piece was going to be fairly narrow compared to what I was expecting for an orc. Now, it worked out okay on the mega knobs that I built before because the overall bulk was still there. The torso of those things made it look more or less like there was an orc chest and shoulders and so forth inside the rig or inside the mech body, but that they were just robot legs, that they were like maybe cut in half on the bottom or something and you had robot legs. With this though, the whole torso part was fairly narrow, and so even at this stage, as I was starting to assemble, I started thinking that I might need to bulk out the top part a bit in order to make it look a little bit more menacing, a little bit more Big Mek like, I guess, for lack of a better word. So starting here, I'm just sort of test fitting over and over again on the whole measure twice, cut once sort of a theory. This is a tool I'm using now, is a WoW stick. It's a really nice tool. I can't remember if I mentioned it in a previous video or not, but it's essentially a small power drill. A lot of times prior to getting that, I was using a pin vise, which I know I showed on a previous video, but a pin vise is essentially a handheld manual drill, which is great for models because you can kind of control the pressure and the speed it's moving at. A Dremel is a nice tool also for that sort of thing, but the problem with the Dremel is that if you're using it on plastic models, it ends up going, even on the slowest setting, it ends up going too fast and you end up melting the plastic. The WoW stick is nice. It's USB chargeable and it keeps the rotation speed slow enough that it won't melt hobby plastic. So I picked up one of these maybe a year and a half ago, and it's fantastic. I use it on pretty much every hobby project at this point that requires any kind of drilling. And interestingly enough, I think I've charged it like once in the last year or so, even though I've done probably, I don't know, a dozen or two models that have required drilling since then. In any case, the goal here is to create a hole maybe, I don't know, a 1/4 inch deep or so, and then I'm going to use paper clips to stick them in there with super glue to pin it together to increase the structural strength of the joint, to make sure that once it's put together, it stays together, doesn't get knocked apart and so forth. Part of the reason here is that the Arachnorig itself is not plastic, so I can't use plastic glue or plastic cement to join it to the legs. The Arachnorig is a resin, which is a little bit more brittle than plastic, and also, like I said, it's going to have to go together with super glue, and so the super glue joints are also can be brittle. So I just want to do everything I can to make sure my model, once I put it together, stays together, especially since there's some, again, non-standard joins going on here as I build out the pieces. In this case, I'm using Gorilla Glue as my cyanoacrylate type glue, and I just take a little bit, put it on the pin that I'm going to use, the paper clip, stick it in there, and then I'm going to start off using water, and then later on remember that I have some accelerator and change that to using the accelerator instead of water to make it set faster, cure faster. I've heard from other content creators that the CA accelerator type stuff leads to a more brittle joint also, compared to just letting it cure on its own. honestly don't know if that's true or not. I haven't experienced a difference myself, or haven't noticed a difference, but just for your own edification, you might consider letting it cure on its own if you want to, just in case that's the case. As I said, I haven't noticed a difference, and I've been doing it for a while, so yeah, your mileage may vary, I guess is the best way to put that. Again, in this case, it's just started by using water. Water does work. It's just a little harder to apply in some cases, like this one, and it's not quite as good as the purpose-built accelerator. Next piece, I'm using the head here. I did use plastic cement there. What I had to do here was the head itself doesn't fit in properly into the head slot on the piece, because there's, again, just kind of a gap that works, and I had a few choices of what to do. I could have used putty, I could have used some plastic sprue or whatever. What I chose, though, was there was a mechanical looking chunk of, well, it was actually the head of the ambot, and by reversing that, which you can't really see very well, it was pretty hard to film, so I didn't bother trying to get better at it, but it was the head of the ambot, when turned upside down, looked like kind of a mechanical chunk that was building together with the bot. And so that's what I did. I took that and I just kind of filed it down until it fit into the hollow behind the orc head, and that became the transition point for me. And here I am again testing it out, make sure it fits in there better, and it provides that kind of more mechanical looking transition between the body of the what do you call it, arachnorig, and the orc head itself, kind of a cybernetic chunk there. And I'm not ready to actually install it yet, but again, I'm using that very organic kind of approach to building the model that I mentioned before. And so that means I'm a little erratic, right? As I see a problem and I think about it, I try to solution it, build out a piece of it, and then I might not actually install it quite yet. I'll just sort of work on it, put it aside, and come back to it when I'm ready. You know, it's just sort of, as I said, a very organic approach. Here you'll see me using some really giant pliers with wire cutters on it, because the hobby nippers are not strong enough for cutting the wire without getting damaged, and I just don't have smaller wire cutters, so I use those giant ones. Sorry, they take up so much of the frame. One of the things to remember as you're doing these sorts of things, again, I think I can't remember if I mentioned in a previous video or not, but I've been using, I don't know if you noticed before or not, but I use a hobby knife to sort of start a pilot hole, and then use the wow stick to actually drill the hole. And where possible, you want to use the table to provide more stability. I've started accelerating the video a little bit more here, just because there's a very long piece of it where I'm doing just a lot of experimenting, trimming, picking up different pieces, filing, etc. This is the part where I'm trying to build his custom Mega Blaster, they call it, which is essentially a big gun where he's cobbled together a lot of pieces of other guns. In my case, I decided to just, again, grab my bits box. I've got weapons from a lot of different factions. In this case, I've got some Necron pieces, I've got some guns from Necromunda pieces, I've got some Space Marine pieces, I've got some Orc pieces, and I'm just sort of grabbing a bunch of stuff that looks like it's interesting and sort of seeing what fits together to make something that looks like a really cool big gun. I also decided that I wanted to fit together more naturally with the guns, or excuse me, the arms of the Arachnorig. You might notice that I kind of skipped over assembling the Arachnorig. That's just because it's not super interesting. It's just sort of the base kit assembly, where I put the arms onto the torso of it. It was just super glue and pinning, which you already saw. But here I've taken there's a weapon that they sold the kit with that's for connecting to that arm point, that arm mount point. And so I'm going to use that as the base of the weapon, and then I took a couple of Necron, I can't remember the name of the weapon is now, but it's like these short carbine looking pieces,
and I joined a couple of them together so it looks like kind of a 4-barrel thing, and then I'm fitting that into that mount point. I also get fairly creative in terms of adhesives, because different adhesives have different properties. So if I'm joining plastic together, using plastic cement obviously makes sense. If there's too big of a gap in the plastic, then I might use what's called sprue goo. And sprue goo is essentially plastic cement that you've dumped a bunch of other plastic into, like sprues, for example, offcuts of sprues, which creates essentially a more goopy paste kind of a substance. And the advantage using sprue goo over regular plastic cement is that it's a gap filler. So you can use it as sort of a paste that fills gaps between chunks of the plastic. It also does a little bit of melting, so it creates a more seamless kind of a result. So as I said, I'm using different kinds of adhesives. One of them is regular plastic cement, one's the sprue goo, one's the cyanoacrylate. In this case, the Gorilla Glue that I'm using is a fairly thick one, which is again kind of a gap filler. The other thing you might see me use, or you did in the earlier part of this weapon assembly, is you saw me flashing a UV light at one point. That's because another useful piece of kit in the adhesive game is using a UV curing resin, and so I just kind of squeeze a little bit of that in and then use the UV light to cure it. That's handy in a few different scenarios, but one of them is once you have things together that are not of like type, for example, the resin and the plastic, you can use that for, again, gap filling. And it's nice because unlike, for example, a CA glue of some kind, it'll sort of self-level. You can also use it for smooth. You can smooth it out. You can work with it using toothpick or a small brush or whatever to shape it, smooth it out a little bit, in order to make a nice level seam, and then hit it with the UV light. And once you hit it with the UV light, it'll cure and be nice and smooth. So again, it's different tools for different jobs, and you'll see me using all of them as I go. Again, here we're just sort of experimenting on different things. I put some pods on the back of the model to represent his what they call custom force field, and then I'm drilling holes in it to add some beads because he has some things. Here's another technique I like to use. Sometimes I just took some green stuff, which is a 2-part epoxy, and I'm using these 2 pieces of plastic card that are textured on one side. They're like, I think it's a roofing. It's supposed to simulate a roofing for trains, but I use the flat side to roll it smooth, and then I use the textured side, which has ridges on it, to create texture on it, which I went really quickly there, but it creates those cables that you might see on some miniatures that have sort of the conduit-like structures. You'll see it again later when I put it on the miniature, and when it'll be running from his head back to his backpack, or to the torso rather. And as I keep going, I'm just continuing to build up different things. I'm looking at where there are holes or where there are things that are less interesting. In this case, I'm building up his waist because, again, I thought it was a little not quite bulky enough. And then just trying to look for areas where I can add little bits of visual interest to the guy. In this case, I thought it'd be cool to have like a fan belt on his back. It makes no sense, from a engineering standpoint, but I just thought it looked cool. So this is a fan belt that I pulled off an engine from the Orc truck kit, and I put it on his back. There you can see him with his beads on his custom force field, and fan belt going on the back there. And again, that's sort of the idea. You just sort of rummage through your Bix box, look at things that might look cool, add them in there, and go to town. The other thing I decided was, and this was something I hadn't planned on initially, I'd planned on his arms being internal, but then I realized that the original kit had the human inside of it actually had his arms sticking out, and they had these like controllers in his arms, sort of like how, if you've seen the movie Aliens, how Ripley used the Big Mek thing, and she had her arms in controllers moving around. So it's a similar kind of idea on the original kit here. And so I decided that adding some orc arms coming out would help bulk it out, and also would probably look pretty cool. So I decided to experiment with that a little bit here, and found a couple orc arms that I liked, cut the weapons off them, because most of the orc arms that I had that were in fists had some kind of weapon on them. And so cut those off, added a little bit of detail, and then glued them into the sockets where the human arms had been, although I had to trim them out a little bit better to make them fit. And then continued to bulk up the front as well with a little bit of putty and more armor plates and things like that. And again, that was a quick shot with the UV resin, and then there's some more of the sprue glue that's going in there. Once again, it's very iterative, just kind of see the problem, keep adding something to it. In this case, I'm using in that case, real quick, I was using the wow stick in an unusual way. I was using it actually almost like a Dremel, because I was using it to hollow out a couple spots to fit things. A little more work with the UV resin. Again, just kind of constant ideating, just sort of looking around the model, seeing what's missing, if anything, seeing things that you don't like, adding to it, bulking up, adding detail. And here I decided that I wanted to have a third ball on the very top of him. Originally, when I did this, I thought I was going to actually add some wiring between the three points for his custom force field, and after looking at them and thinking through it, I decided that probably didn't really add much to it. So again, your plan can change as your model develops. You might think you're going to have an element on it and decide you're not going to later on. It just sort of is a decision you're going to make in the moment. One of the things you might notice is when I'm using the cyanoacrylate accelerator, it's very quick, obviously, because I've accelerated the video, but it comes in a spray bottle usually, but I don't use it as a spray. Instead, I pull the spray cap off, and I actually use the hose of the spray bottle as essentially a dropper applicator. It has like a little bead of accelerant that sort of drips off the bottom if you just sort of tap it. And if you're wondering why I do that, if you noticed, the reason I do that is it's much more precise application. And if I don't do that, then the spray is so much on these small models that it kind of floods the whole area, and that makes it much more difficult to apply more glue somewhere else in the model later until it evaporates or dries. And so just don't do it. It makes it much harder to model in other parts of the build as you go. So that's why I use the drop applicator. And even then, sometimes it'll spread farther than I want it to. So it's one of those things you just want to be very careful and very localized with it. I could also probably just get like an eyedropper or something for it, but the bottle's pretty tall, and so rather than getting a super long pipette for it, I just use what came with the bottle. And here's me applying those hoses I talked about. Just kind of gluing them into those sockets I drilled in the shoulders, and then I had drilled some holes in the head as well, and I'll be piping them into the head and gluing them down there as well. And then I'm also, since he's got the controllers in his hands now, I'm going to put some wiring in there, and that's just some wiring that I got from some electronic components or some connectors, I guess, for some electronic components, and just trims down really nicely. Inside also is some braided wire, which in other projects I've actually stripped the insulation off the wire and used the braided wire by itself. You can either use it whole, or you can pull a few strands off and use it for smaller cables. Super useful. One of the things that I encourage anybody who wants to do kit bashing is just sort of look around and find stuff. Electronic components are always useful, even if it's old circuit boards. You can pull capacitors and what am I trying to say? Capacitors, diodes, resistors, any of that kind of stuff. You can pull them off and use them for part of your hobby project. You can use the wires, the connectors, all that kind of ribbon cables, any of that sort of thing can serve you well as part of your kit bash, especially if you're doing something for 40K like technical wise. And so I just, whenever I see interesting things like that, I'll grab it, throw it in my bits box, and find uses for it later on. So in this case, like I said, I'm just using the wiring, drilling it into the body of the thing between the servo arms, and then trimming it down, pulling some of the insulation off, and then I'll be putting it into the bottoms of the hands where I left the handles of the weapons that he was using, and then I'm going to add a bit of tubing, like just regular plastic tubing, onto the bottom of that to insert the wire into as a sort of mount point for the wire, and that'll be his hand controllers for the servo arms. How does it work? I don't know. It looks cool. So that's the idea. It's sort of rule of cool as you go. And then the last piece that I'm doing here is I'm actually putting a breastplate on him that's coming from, again, those ambots that I use for my other mega knobs. And that way, again, he's getting sort of a visual identity that matches with them. And then once I did that, I noticed that there was some kind of gaps in the shoulder area. So then I added in some shoulder pads that I got from one of the regular orc kits. I can't remember if it was the knob kit or the regular boys kit, but either way, I took some shoulder pads and sort of added those in around the tops of the arms, and covering kind of the gaps in the breastplate and the arms and so forth. And that was just a good way to cover that gap and also just bulk out the shoulders again a little bit more. And that's what you see me doing in here is trying to fit those in there, and then trimming out some of the areas that are blocking them and fitting them in again, and again sort of trial and error. And then doing a little bit of gap filling with that sprue goo, and then I'll be going to the other side here shortly. And then coming up here in a second, I'll be putting up the finished product. And what I didn't show on screen is I also built him a little buddy. He's got a grot assistant that goes with him, and so I put one of those together as well with just a simple modification from a Blood Bowl Goblin. Here's the finished product after being primed. And on the next video I'll be painting him. But yeah, here he is after being primed, and then next up is his little Gretchen buddy dragging a can of oil around for him. Well, this concludes the video on how to kitbash, and specifically my Big Mek and Mega Armour kitbash. A few things I'd like to leave you with when you're kitbashing. Number one, start with a vision. Number two, be flexible with that vision. Number three, let your model grow organically. Kind of like I described before about finding things in your bits box, deciding to add them or not, trying them out, getting rid of them, pull them off, etc. Number four, make use of different tools for different jobs, like the example I gave with regard to the different kinds of glues and adhesives and putties and so forth. And the last one, which I didn't really cover in the video, so I'll talk a little bit more about now, is that sometimes you need to build in order to break. What do I mean by that? Well, one of the first really big, like massive kit bashes I had was for a vehicle, and in my vision for it was I wanted to make a half track for my orc army, and to represent a truck. And in my head, I knew that I wanted to take a Rhino chassis, which is basically an APC for the Space Marines, for those of you who don't know. And I wanted to take it and use that as the back end, and I wanted to take a World War II Jeep model that I had and use that as the front end of the half track. So again, for those of you who don't know, a half track is essentially a track in the back, or a track vehicle in the back, and a wheeled vehicle in the front. And so I wanted to match those together. But I realized that actually just taking those two vehicles and putting them together was going to be too big, especially the track part was going to be too big. And so I decided I needed to make the Rhino part smaller. What I didn't know is how to do that from the kit as it was. So I was at a hobby shop when I was doing this particular kit bash, and so I sat down and I actually built the Rhino kit as it was described on the instructions. And the funny part about it is I had this young boy actually sit down at the table, and he was watching me build it. He just thought it was interesting to watch somebody hobby. So I built this entire Rhino, soup to nuts. Looked great. It's brand new. And this kid's sitting there watching me do it and everything like that. And then this look of horror creeped over his face when I pulled out my Dremel tool and had a saw blade on it, and I just started cutting this brand new model in half. He had no idea why I was doing it. I'm just like, just cut it right in half. Anyway, like I said, sometimes you have to build in order to break. So I cut it in half, shortened the overall length, and then started figuring out how to fit it together. So in this case, why I say that is because I couldn't, I couldn't figure out how to make it into the thing I wanted until I'd fully built it. And so I essentially reverse engineered how the orcs would have done it. The orcs would have found a big rhino, and then they would have started chopping it apart. So that's what I did. So as I said, sometimes you have to build it in order to break it. Now, a more cost-effective method would have been for me to find a fully built one on eBay and then then started breaking it apart. But you live and you learn. Anyway, the next video that I'm going to do is going to be on painting the Big Mek and his little grot assistant dude. So I hope you join me for that one as well. Thanks for watching, and until next time, keep on looting.